Those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Savannah Robity. I'm the program director here at the Schweinfurth Art Center. Welcome to our trunk show series and to our QAQ exhibits. As many of you know, this is not the only quilt program that we run. We have Quilting by the Lake, we have Studio Schweinfurth programs, and our 2023 programs and workshops and classes and lectures will be announced very soon, so keep in tune for that. But otherwise, I'll get you started on what you're here for. So, Daisy Aschehoug, yes, Daisy Aschehoug is an American quilter living in Norway. She's a quilt pattern designer and has published a book co-authored with Heather Black, Quilt Modern and Bold Stripes. She teaches and she lectures worldwide, and of course she is an exhibiting artist in QAQ downstairs, so don't forget to go check out that quilt. And I'm not going to get too much into your bio because I'm sure you're going to tell us all about yourself, so I'll pass it off to Daisy.
One of the first questions that I'm asked, whether I'm abroad or whether I'm speaking with the North American audience, is how did I end up in Norway? So let's get that part out of the way right at the beginning. The short answer is that while my husband was teaching at Louisiana State University, he applied for and got a job in Norway. So we moved about 5 years ago, and we plan to be there for the indefinite future. Another question that I'm asked is, how did I get into designing and making quilts? So for the next half hour or so, I'm going to touch on that question, starting with a little bit of my background from before I started making quilts, and then I'll move into some of the stories and themes around my quilt making process. It's hard for me to describe my background efficiently because I've done a lot of different things. I have been a whitewater kayak instructor and a raft guide. I worked with teenagers in wilderness settings. I was a wildland firefighter. I worked in natural resource management, and I've mediated district court cases. All throughout that, though, and back into my childhood, I wanted to be an artist. And the problem was I wanted to be all the things. So pursuing art education was something that got pushed to the side to make room for other things. So I don't have a formal art education. I've taken some classes here and there, but I think that my development as a quilter has been driven by and supported by a steady stream of contracts with magazines and publishers to design and make quilts. I started making quilts around 2009 or 2010. I didn't grow up sewing. My mom, who's here in the audience, my mom was a home economics teacher, so she taught lots of kids how to sew and manage finances and cook and those sorts of things. And she's a quilter as well. She's an excellent quilter. But I was a typical teenager, and my parents couldn't teach me anything. So luckily I came around, though, as an adult, and when I was about 30 years old, my mom was still willing to teach me because I wanted to make a baby quilt for a friend who was having a new baby. So I finally learned how to thread the sewing machine and sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I didn't bring any of my early quilts with me on this trip, but many of them were art traditional. I also experimented with some different techniques like paper piecing and applique, but it was the 1/4 circle square and sewing a curved seam that really captured my attention. Now, I didn't plan very well. I was supposed to have my 1/4 circle square templates out here to show you, and I admit that I have forgotten them. But the 1/4 circle square is very similar to the drunkard's path block in traditional quilting. There's a little bit of a difference in the mathematical arc of the curve, and there's some difference in the background space that's around that curve, but those differences don't really matter. What mattered is that I became infatuated with the idea of sewing very precise curves and then piecing them together into my quilt designs. My first magazine quilts incorporated, we'll see how far this goes. Oh, lovely. My first magazine designs incorporated curves into designs that were heavily influenced by traditional quilts. This is a work in progress right now because the original version, I sold it a few years ago, it's long gone, but this is called Spin-Off. and this was published in Modern Quilts Unlimited in 2016. Spinoff is based on the log cabin block. I kept that strong central focal point and the idea of things sort of radiating out towards the edge, but everywhere that the original log cabin strips would end, I inserted curves where there had been rectangles before. And then I divided the composition into 4 quadrants, which allowed for just a little bit of a spinning motion to occur in this spin-off piece. Other quilts had stories and little bits of my life that were woven into them. In the far back corner over there is a quilt that I'm not going to talk about. When I was living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I kept seeing stories in the headlines, news headlines of about accidental gun deaths amongst children. And when I was driving through the pickup line at my son's Montessori school, the car door in front of me opened and a gun fell out onto the ground right on the school premises. Another incident that made national news was that Alton Sterling was killed by 2 Baton Rouge police officers. And then 2 weeks later, someone traveled to Baton Rouge and shot 6 police officers in response to that, and 3 of those officers died. So all of these experiences and others made me feel like there was danger lurking just beyond what was immediately in sight. So that quilt is called Sightseeing, both because it captures this idea of targets and the sights of a rifle, but it's also a play on words because it captures the idea that I didn't really feel like I fit in there. We had moved with the intention of making it our home and raising our children there, but I always felt like I was a little bit of a tourist that was just visiting. Other quilts had stories that are a little bit lighter. The next one is called Pivot. My children and I maximized our membership with the Baton Rouge Zoo and spent many long days with the animals there. And Pivot came from my fascination with the way that flamingos bend their legs at the ankle. And also, it has those bright bursts of color that you sometimes see in flamingos that are juxtaposed with the pale pink. Pivot was my first time experimenting with very small curves. Those little red curves have a radius of 1.25 inches. And it was also the first time that I realized how much I loved pink, how pink resonated with me. I don't remember liking pink very much growing up as a little girl, but somewhere along the way something shifted. And I suppose I have more pink quilts than I thought, but pink ends up finding its way into my work quite regularly, along with blues. Pinks and blues are my favorite. Other quilts don't have a story that goes with them at all. The next quilt is called Half Spots, and it was also part of that series I was making at the time where I was exploring lines and curves. With Half Spots, I wanted to broaden the range of sizes that I used in this building block that is my favorite, that quarter circle square. So there's a range in there that starts with the small end with 1.5 inches, and it goes all the way up to those very largest curves, which have a radius of 12 inches. Now, the next quilts I'm going to talk about are up here, and I'll talk about a few things at once that I kind of worked on simultaneously. Many of my early magazine quilts were made with solid fabrics because I knew that I was making for an audience that would be reading a magazine, and I wanted those materials to be available to them long after the magazine had been printed. But I had bags and bags of scraps left over from my traditional quilting days. And even though we pared those down when we moved abroad, I still had several bags of things that were very important to me that I wanted to use, even though I didn't have a plan for them. So I had read Sherry Lynn Wood's book called The Improv Handbook for Modern Quilters and fell in love with her approach. She called it scores for improvisation, like musical scores. But what she meant was that she created rules for how she would sew fabric together without a pattern. So the rules that I decided that I liked were to sew all of my seams so that they were oriented on an X and Y axis. Now, somewhere along the way, I decided that if one curve was good, 2 was even better, and maybe 3 would be best. So I started exploring this series that I call Giant Nested Curves. The first version utilized that approach of taking scraps and piecing them horizontally and vertically. And one thing that I really liked is that even though they're different colors and sizes and there's a lot of different things happening here, the curves provide a very strong framework, and the seams have this sort of unifying factor across all of the different blocks. Another version that I made used offcuts from a project that I had previously sewn. I labored over the color palette for this particular project, and I had too many pieces at the end. I didn't want to throw them away. So the rule that I came up with for myself on this was to sew them all together at different angles. I didn't want to have any of them end up at a perpendicular or a 90-degree angle. I also usually pick a background that has a lot of contrast with the foreground, but for this one I picked the material that was used most regularly in the scrappy area because I felt like those narrow strips would not cause the curve to be broken, and it wouldn't have a lot of bleed in between the two. This piece is made with material that I dyed at a workshop. It's particularly memorable for me because it was in March of 2020, just before the world shut down entirely. I was in Ireland taking an indigo dye workshop with a woman named Catherine Davey. And for this particular piece, I really enjoyed the texture and the pattern that's created from the shibori process of dyeing the material. And I didn't want to cut it up. I mean, I'm a quilter making utility quilts. That's my approach, but I didn't want to cut up this material into small pieces, yet I wanted to use it somehow. So placing it inside of these giant nested curves allowed me to feature that fabric. This is probably my most requested workshop, I think because it features a range of design aesthetics, but there's also a range of investment that you can make as a quilter in the various approaches to piecing. I had planned to move around the room, but I will go this way. Okay, so this next piece, which is the very large gray piece on the wall over there, was inspired by something that I saw on the back of a grocery store in the little neighborhood that we lived in when we first moved to Oslo. This grocery store, we had to walk behind it in order to get to it to do our shopping. And there was a large window on the back of the building, and on the other side of the window was this huge ironwork. It was a large circle that had chevron bars coming down the center of it. And it was beautiful. Its purpose was quite basic. I mean, it was intended to keep someone from throwing a rock through the window and stealing everything out of the grocery store. But the solution, it was such an elegant solution that it stuck with me. So I went back to my sketchbook and I took the largest curve that I work with, which is a 12-inch curve, and I added in those bold stripes in there to try to match what I had seen on that grocery store. I call that quilt circle, but I spell it the way that Norwegians spell the word circle, which is S-I-R-K-E-L. I made that was the first quilt that I made after we moved to Norway in 2017, and then it was published the following year in 2018. As I was making the circle, I had to do several different sort of proof of concepts or test out several different ideas because I wanted the circles to touch in a particular way and create a particular effect. But I had all these leftover pieces that I wanted to then use in something else. When I trimmed away the pieces where the curves had been cut out, I was left with some triangle shapes. So I took the uncut fabric that I had not used for that, paired it with the strip sets, and made a stack of half-square triangles of various sizes. Now, there's another quilt artist that I admire very much. Her name is Alexis Daisy, and she often references something called kintsugi in her work. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing pottery with materials that are mixed with precious metals, like silver or gold. Instead of making the repair invisible, the repair actually draws attention to that spot, and the break then becomes a celebrated part of that piece's history. So my impulse was to take all of my different sizes and trim them down so that I could put them together. But with that kintsugi perspective in mind, I decided to select some of my favorite scraps and build out the smallest blocks so that they then fit with the larger ones. Then I hand quilted this in the early months of the pandemic, and I call that piece Breaking Patterns, because this went against all of the habits that I had developed as a quilt designer, which were to use curves, to make quilts with patterns so that other people could make them, and also to hand quilt, because up until the quilt called Circle, I had quilted everything on my domestic machine. I had done everything by machine, and that was my first experience hand quilting a quilt all the way through. One of the most interesting influences on quilting today, I think, is the presence of the internet and the ability for quilters to connect with one another online and share ideas. One of the job interviews that my husband had was in the eastern part of the state of Washington. And as he was preparing to go, I got online and connected with a quilter there named Heather Black. Heather designs quilts in the same way that I do, with curves, and she was fantastic about sharing information with me so that we could, discuss what our life might be like if he got that job and we moved to that part of the country. Well, obviously we moved to Norway instead, but I kept in touch with Heather, and our friendship grew online, and then we met in 2018 at QuiltCon and decided that we wanted to write a book together. We knew it had to have curves, and we also decided that all of our quilt patterns needed some other element, and so we decided to include stripes in that. This quilt is called Ruched, and it's from the book, and it's unique in my lineup of quilts because most of my quilts are the result of several iterations of sketches that I do digitally. I explore different ideas, I shift things, I move things, I come up with different versions that I consider as a whole before I actually start a project. But this piece came to mind kind of in full, and I sketched it quickly on paper. I made a quick digital design for the book publisher, and then I dove right into cutting fabric. I have a copy of the book here, Quilt Modern Curves and Bold Stripes, and one of the things that I am particularly excited about in the book is that Heather and I decided we would have half of the designs include 2 different fabric requirements and instructions for how to make them, because we wanted to give quilters a choice as to whether they would piece together their stripes, picking out their own colors or including their own prints, or whether they would take a more efficient approach maybe and use striped fabrics. And of course each of those requires their own sets of fabric amounts and instructions. So I had stripes and curves on the brain for quite some time after writing the book, and in 2019 I made that quilt called Vining, and that was for the for the magazine that's associated with the Modern Quilt Guild's annual show called QuiltCon. Most of my quilts, so many of them are big, and I was really trying to design something small for that particular project. Obviously, I sort of failed, but I had these elements that I liked, and it was, I liked them, but I wasn't very inspired by them, and it was only when I repeated those elements and began to stack them on top of each other that I saw a secondary pattern, and it made me fall in love with the idea enough to commit to making that particular project. A year later, I made Grassland Embers, which is a bit of an homage to my time as a wildland firefighter in California and Montana. And then, after I had worked with curves and then curves and stripes, I decided that I wanted to experiment with curves and triangles. So this quilt is called Cider Press, and this is one of a series that I did that included curves and triangles. Growing up in Alabama, I remember going to this one particular orchard and getting apples and hot apple cider in the fall. This sort of thick, hot apple cider. And getting apples in the fall in Norway is definitely a thing, but I haven't found the same apple cider that I remembered loving as a child. So when I was designing this, I instinctually picked this bright apple red color, and when I saw these sort of sharp triangles pushing up against that, I couldn't unsee the idea of a cider press and cider, and it was in the fall when I designed it, so I definitely had that on my mind. Ginkgo fans is an experiment with building a design with the specific intent of including a variety of fabrics in a tricolor palette. So often, quilters decide on making a project, and then they go out and buy fabric for that project. If they make a mistake, or if they run out of material, the impulse is to go buy some more fabric to finish it so that everything matches. And I wanted to test out a design that was versatile enough that it could work with whatever material a quilter has in their supplies already. For me, that was pinks and blues and a neutral. And after I had finished making this design, I really liked the delicate fan shape that had emerged, and it reminded me of ginkgo leaves, so I call this one Ginkgo Fans. Now, I'd like to talk about the next quilt in conjunction with the quilt that is downstairs in the show here. The quilt that's in the show here is called Spinning Tradition, and it's sort of big, and it is blue and yellow. Throughout my work, or my art, or my craft, whatever you'll call it, I like to give myself challenges, both in design as well as construction. And the quilt that's in the exhibition downstairs has a little over 700 curves in it. So that was a challenge for me, was to piece all of those curves, sew them together, press them, trim them, continue sewing, press, trim, repeat over and over and over again. There was a tremendous amount of cutting of material that I had to do to make that. And I was about 30% of the way through the cutting process when I realized I had this tool that would make things go much faster. So again, here's where I'm supposed to hold up my quarter circle square templates that I forgot. But I manufacture my own quilting templates. They're these pieces of plastic that you can place onto the table and cut around to get the material. I have a laser cutter, which does this for me. So my laser cutter is a big metal box about the size of a copy machine, and I can lift the lid of the laser cutter, place my plastic inside, and send some shape files from my computer to the laser, and then press start. There's a mounted laser head on a XY gantry system. I don't know all the mechanics, that's what he's for. And it cuts my material. Now, I acquired the laser cutter so that I could cut these plastic templates, but I used it for several months before I found an application for fabric that made sense to me. But I was staring down the to-do list of 1,400 pieces of material to cut, and I thought, now is a good time to have that efficiency and have that tool help me out. Having that tool has opened up new opportunities for me in my design work to do things that I wouldn't otherwise have done or pursue. And this quilt is called Many Nested Curves, and this is one of them. Each of those color shifts that you see is a separate seam, so those are all different pieces of fabric. This was an exercise in figuring out how many curves I could put into a 12-inch repeating block. And the answer for this one was 28. There are 28 curves inside each 12-inch block. And in this 6x6 arrangement, that's a little over 1,000 curved seams in there. Now, I used the same approach with this quilt that I did here, where I mix and match colors within a particular color palette, but I wanted one color to remain constant, to unify the whole piece. So I kept the blue fabric, being consistent running throughout, but I incorporated lots of things in the other materials. Now, all of the quilts that I've shown you so far have utilized a curve that is a mathematical equivalent of a quarter of a circle. All of those curved seams have that feature to them. But I'm also very curious and very excited about sewing improvised curves, or curves that don't require the use of a template. And Pebble Pop is an example of that. I wanted an exercise for myself where I combined improvisation, and I used a log cabin approach to making each of these blocks. So there's a centerpiece, and then you build out and around. I feel like traditional quilters had such a good plan for how they sewed things. It's the approach that I took here. The last quilt that I'll talk about today is called Swoopies, and it's that last piece over in the corner. As I was working on the book, I was sewing strip set after strip set after strip set. I would sit down for hours at the sewing machine and sew together long, skinny strips. I would grab two and sew them. And I really enjoyed this repetitive activity. There was something almost meditative about it. I decided that I wanted to see if I could apply a curve element to a strip set that I could then cut up and use. So I began experimenting with cutting narrow strips of material that I could then put into a slab. I did succeed in making arcs that I then began to deconstruct and take apart and sew them back together again using the same improv curve techniques that I use in Pebble Pop. Are there any questions? The question is, what machine do I use? I started out quilting on a Bernina Sport, and that my mom generously lent me, and then I had a Janome Memory Craft 8900, but I had a little problem with my needle plate when I was sewing my strips for my book, so I had to switch to something, and now I have an industrial Juki. I think it's a DDL 900 maybe, but I love it. I had no idea in my sort of upbringing as a quilter that an industrial machine was not the most expensive, and it's just fantastic. It sews a tried and true straight seam, and that's all I ever do. So the question is, what kind of threads, what weight? I use a 50 weight thread, and I do use Aurifil. I was an Aurifil artisan for a year, so I have a little bit of loyalty. They gave me lots of materials, but I don't find the difference in thread to be all that big of a deal. But when it comes to hand quilting, this piece is hand quilted with the Aurifil 12 weight, and I absolutely love it. I've hand quilted with pearl cotton in 5 and 8 and 10 weights, but the 12 weight is fantastic because it's just big enough to be very visible, but it's not so wide in its diameter that it creates a lot of drag as you pull it through the quilt. So I also have a long arm machine. Ellen, the resident artist here, and I were chatting about that earlier. I love using the long arm. I have an Innova, and it's fantastic for finishing my quilts, but I also based my hand quilting projects with the long arm because then I don't have to use safety pins. And I've never been a big fan of using the spray glue on my quilts. It works for some, but I haven't enjoyed it myself. The question is, what do I mean by utility quilts? And maybe by now, after sharing so much about myself, you can tell I'm conflicted. Am I an artist? Am I not an artist? Am I a designer? Do you have to have formal training to be these things? I think that quilting was a fantastic medium for me to dive into because I always told myself, even if it's not art, it'll keep you warm. It has a use, it has this function. And I also enjoy making big quilts because I do expect that they will all be used at some point. After nobody wants me to come speak anymore, I'll retire them all and my children will build forts out of them and play with them. And so that's kind of what I mean by utility quilt. What is the quilt scene like in Oslo? It's an older crowd in Oslo, but there is a quilt scene, which was a little surprising because sometimes it seems like Norwegians come out of the womb knowing how to knit and ski, but most of them are knitters. and I was surprised to find so many quilters. But there's a lot of connection between Norway and the United States. And actually the only grown-up book that I have read in Norwegian from cover to cover is the book on quilting. And it's fascinating how much influence quilting in the United States has had on quilting in Norway over the years. A large part of the population left Norway in the middle of the last century, and many of them went to the US and sewed in groups where they could continue to speak Norwegian or have Norwegian food, or maybe they used those sewing and quilting clubs to learn English. So quilting became this medium that connected the two different cultures. And many of those people either brought it back or introduced it back into Norway. I can't speak definitively about exactly how quilting started there, but there are a lot of quilters, and there's a fantastic quilt shop in Oslo that is big by US standards. Norwegian shops tend to be a little smaller, but that quilt shop is quite successful. So. My favorite color bathrobe when I sew. Well, I have a studio in a building that is an old hospital. It was an old, almost a little bit like a nursing home. And so I have to leave the house to go sew, and that might be a little chilly in Norway for me to be doing it in a bathrobe. But no, the place where I have a studio is fantastic. There are over 60 creative businesses there who do everything from painting and ceramics to documentary and film production. There are sound producers, there's a drone maker, there's a woodworker in the basement as well. So there's a variety of people there, and it's been a lovely community. They wouldn't care at all if I wore a bathrobe though. I love talking about quilts, so thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for being here.